February 1945, Hürtgen Forest, Germany. American infantry aren't being overrun because they lack courage or numbers. They're being killed by a flaw measured in seconds. A Thompson submachine gun burns through its magazine almost instantly, and every reload creates a 4 to 5 second silence. In the Hürtgen Forest, German defenders learned to wait for it, and when American guns went quiet, they struck without mercy. Then something appeared on the front line that the Wehrmacht had never encountered before. Staff Sergeant Bobby Castellano was issued a modified Thompson, unlike anything in the field. 2 complete firing systems mounted into a single weapon, twin barrels, a combined rate of fire approaching 1,400 rounds per minute. When German forces assaulted his position, the results shocked both sides. The weapon didn't merely slow the attack, it tore it apart. Surviving German troops radioed rear command in panic, reporting entrenched heavy machine guns. In reality, they were facing one soldier armed with an experimental submachine gun. The weapon was never meant to exist. It was built in a small improvised workshop behind the lines by James Watkins, a machinist turned soldier who ignored doctrine, bypassed regulation, and solved a problem commanders couldn't. Only 183 of these weapons were ever produced. To the Germans, they became Doppeltod, rebel death. To the Americans who carried them, they were something far simpler. They were survival. This is the classified story of a battlefield innovation that briefly changed the balance of close-quarters combat, defied every rule of procurement, saved lives under impossible conditions. For more than 3 decades, February 1945. The Hürtgen Forest, Western Germany. This was not a battlefield designed for movement. It was a maze of dense pine-frozen ravines and ground so saturated with shell fire that foxholes collapsed faster than men could dig them. American infantry had been fighting here for months, not advancing, not breaking through, simply surviving. Casualty reports told a grim story. Veterans who had survived Normandy and the Ardennes were dying here, in terrain that reduced modern armies to knife-range chaos. The problem was not courage, it was not manpower, and it was not German superiority in numbers. The problem was mechanical, and it was measured in seconds. By early 1945, the Thompson submachine gun was everywhere on the American front line. Millions had been produced. It was trusted, familiar, and lethal at close range. On paper, it was perfect for forest combat. In reality, it carried a flaw that became deadly inside the Hürtgen. A standard Thompson emptied its 30-round magazine in just over 2 seconds of sustained fire. Once empty, the gun went silent. Reloading took 4 to 5 seconds. Longer, if hands were cold, shaking, or coated in mud. 4 to 5 seconds may sound insignificant. In the Hürtgen Forest, it was long enough to die. German defenders learned this quickly. They didn't rush blindly into American fire. They listened. They waited for the familiar stutter, the sudden drop in volume when a Thompson ran dry, and in that brief silence they counterattacked with ruthless precision. Grenades, machine pistols, prey-registered fire. American after-action reports would later confirm the pattern. Assaults stalled during reload cycles. Entire advances collapsed because squads lost, stalled. Men were being killed not because their weapons lacked power, but because their weapons could not stay alive long enough. Frontline officers sent increasingly desperate requests back through the system. They needed sustained fire. They needed something that could keep shooting while a magazine was changed. But wartime bureaucracy moved slowly, even as casualty lists grew longer. New weapons required testing. Testing required approval. Approval required time, and time was something the infantry no longer had. What happened next did not come from high command. It did not come from a research lab or a weapons board. It came from behind the lines, from someone who understood machines better than manuals. James Watkins was not a general. He was not a designer celebrated in military history. He was a machinist. Before the war, Watkins had worked with firearms at the industrial level. He understood the Thompson not as a symbol but as steel tolerances and moving parts. When reports from the Hürtgen began filtering back, The Thompson wasn't failing because it was weak. It was failing because it stopped. And Watkins asked a question that broke every rule in the procurement manual. What if it didn't? What if a soldier could reload one magazine while the gun kept firing from another? What if the reload window and the 4 to 5 seconds that killed men simply disappeared? The answer was crude, heavy, inefficient by peacetime standards, and completely illegal by regulation. But in the winter of 1945, legality mattered far less than survival. Within weeks, Watkins would build a weapon that was never meant to exist, a modification so extreme that it bypassed every approval process, ignored every doctrine, and challenged what a single infantryman could do in close-quarters combat. By the time it reached the front line, the Germans would give it a name, and the men who carried it would discover something even more important. For the first time in the Hürtgen Forest, their guns would not go silent. To understand why American infantry were being cut down in the Hürtgen Forest, you have to understand how close this fighting really was. This was not open field warfare. This was combat measured in yards, sometimes in steps. Dense pine blocked visibility. Slopes and ravines broke formations apart. Units rarely saw the enemy until they were already within grenade range. Engagement distances collapsed to 15, 20, sometimes 30 yards. At that range, volume of fire mattered more than accuracy, and that was exactly why the Thompson submachine gun had been issued so widely, firing .45 caliber ammunition at a high cyclic rate. The Thompson was designed to dominate close quarters. In short bursts, it was devastating. In trenches, bunkers, and urban fighting, it had already proven its worth. The answer to the Hürtgen problem did not come from headquarters. It did not come from a weapons board, a design bureau, or a procurement office. It came from someone who was never supposed to make that kind of decision. James Watkins was a technical sergeant assigned to an ordnance unit far behind the front line. He wasn't an inventor chasing recognition. He was a machinist who understood weapons at the level most officers never did. As moving systems with tolerances, stress points, and failure modes. Before the war, Watkins had worked in firearm manufacturing. He knew the Thompson submachine gun intimately, not as a symbol of American fire, but as steel receivers, bolts, springs, and threaded barrels. When casualty reports from the Hürtgen Forest began reaching ordnance channels, Watkins saw something that wasn't being addressed. The Thompson wasn't underpowered. It wasn't unreliable. It was simply doing exactly what it was built to do, stopping at the worst possible moment. Watkins focused on the reload window. Every analysis from the front pointed to the same failure point. The 4 to 5 second silence while a magazine was changed. Training could reduce it, discipline could manage it. But nothing could remove it entirely unless the weapon didn't have to stop firing to reload. That idea alone violated doctrine. Infantry weapons were designed around single firing systems. One bolt, one barrel, one magazine. Reload meant silence, and that was accepted as unavoidable. Watkins didn't accept it. The receiver was massively overbuilt by modern standards. The operating system was robust, the barrel attachment was simple, and most importantly, the gun could tolerate far more sustained stress than doctrine allowed. So Watkins asked a question that procurement offers systems together. Not a twin barrel added for show, not a gimmick, 2 fully independent guns, each with its own bolt, barrel, and magazine, mechanically linked to fire from a single trigger. In theory, one system could continue firing while the other was reloaded. The reload window would disappear. This was not a proposal that could be submitted through channels. It violated regulations, safety standards, and standardization rules. There was no authorization for it, so Watkins didn't ask. Working with a small team of ordnance specialists, he began building a prototype using whatever materials were available. 2 Thompson receivers, salvaged aluminum, vertical alignment, reduced lateral recoil, and kept the weapon manageable in close quarters. The most difficult part was the trigger linkage. Watkins designed a system that transferred force from a single trigger to both firing mechanisms. The timing was critical. If both barrels fired at the exact same instant, Too much delay, and the benefit was lost. The solution was subtle, a near-simultaneous firing sequence with a fractional delay, close enough to feel continuous, auchy enough to manage recoil and heat. By late December 1944, the first prototype was complete. It was heavy, awkward, inefficient by peacetime standards. But when Watkins test-fired it, the effect was unmistakable. 2 magazines, 60 rounds ready. Continuous fire where standard Thompson would have gone silent. You could empty one magazine while the other kept shooting. Reload without stopping, then switch. Suppressive fire no longer came in bursts. It came as a sustained presence. When the prototype was demonstrated to senior ordnance officers, the reaction was immediate, not enthusiasm, urgency. They didn't debate whether it fit doctrine. They asked how fast it could be built. The weapon was quietly designated as Anakin immediately. Watkins had bypassed every regulation, not because he wanted to break rules, but because the rules were killing men faster than the enemy. Within weeks, the first modified weapons were issued to Wehrmacht units, engaged in the worst close quarters fighting in Germany. No fanfare, no announcements. Just a heavy, unfamiliar weapon placed in the hands of soldiers who had already learned what silence meant in the Hürtgen Forest. What happened next would determine whether Watkins' illegal solution was a desperate mistake, or the answer infantry had been dying for. The first twin Thompson was never meant to be elegant. It was built for speed, not appearance, for function, not approval. The workshop that produced it wasn't a factory. It was a converted ordnance space behind the lines, stocked with damaged weapons, salvage metal, and whatever materials could be pulled from nearby depots. Watkins and Hürtgen Forest continued to arrive daily. Casualty figures climbed. Infantry units were still being broken during assaults that stalled in the same way. The silence, then counterfire. There was no time for refinement. The process began with 2 standard M1A1 Thompson receivers. Stocks were removed. Mounting points were machined by hand. A custom frame was fabricated to hold the 2 weapons in a rigid vertical alignment. Every decision was practical. Vertistacking kept the weapon narrow enough to maneuver in forest terrain. It also reduced the sideways torque that would have made horizontal mounting uncontrollable. Each firing system remained independent. Separate magazines. If one system failed, the other could still operate. The heart of the design remained the trigger linkage. Watkins refined the mechanism through repeated trial and error. Too much synchronization produced violent recoil. Too little eliminated the benefit of sustained fire. The final configuration allowed both systems to fire in rapid alternation. Lent close enough to feel simultaneous, offset enough to maintain control. By the time the first complete prototype was assembled, it was immediately obvious that this was not a standard infantry weapon. The gun weighed nearly twice as much as a normal Thompson. With 2 30-round magazines inserted, it was heavier than many soldiers expected, but weight was not the metric that mattered most. What mattered was time. When Watkins test-fired the weapon, the difference was unmistakable. A standard Thompson barked, paused, then barked again. The modified weapon roared. You could fire one magazine dry while the other kept running. Reload without silence. Switch back, fire again. The reload window was gone. Word of the prototype spread quickly within ordnance circles. Senior officers were brought in to observe a formal demonstration. The test was simple. Diets were placed at typical forest engagements distance, the 20 to 30 yards. No exaggerated range, no ideal conditions. Watkins loaded both magazines, braced the weapon, and pulled the trigger. The sound was different from anything they expected. Deeper, sustained, less like a submachine gun, more like a light machine gun compressed into a single infantry weapon. The targets didn't show neat holes. They splintered wood fragments scattered behind the line. The volume of fire overwhelmed the space in front of the muzzle. When the firing stopped, there was no debate. This was not a theoretical improvement. It was a functional solution to a real battlefield problem. The weapon was immediately authorized for limited production as an experimental modification. No press release, just a quiet directive to build as many as possible, as quickly as possible. Production was constrained by reality. Each unit required skilled machine work. Frames had to be fabricated individually. Trigger linkages had to be hand-fitted and tested. There was no assembly line, when only craftsmen working in shifts. Every complumption was corrected on the spot. By early 1945, the first batch was ready for issue. There was no ceremony when they reached the front, no manuals were distributed, no training films were produced. Soldiers received the weapons with brief instructions: how to load, how to alternate magazines, how to control recoil. And one unspoken warning: if mishandled, it could injure the operator. If overused, it would reveal your position. But if used correctly, it could keep firing when everything else stopped. The modified Thompsons were issued selectively. Units engaged in the worst close quarters fighting received priority. Forest combat. Among the soldiers chosen to carry them was Staff Sergeant Bobby Castellano. He didn't know how many existed. He didn't know where it came from. He knew only that it was heavier than anything he'd carried before, and that it promised something no other weapon in the Hürtgen Forest could offer. Silence was no longer inevitable. As Bobby took position in his foxhole before dawn on February 17, 1945, he was about to test whether Watkins' illegal solution could survive the only evaluation that mattered. Contact February 17, 1945. Just before dawn, the Hürtgen Forest was quiet in the way only battlefields get quiet. The kind of silence that meant something was about to break. Staff Sergeant Bobby Castellano crouched low in his foxhole, boots pressed into frozen mud. The ground around him was pocked with old shell craters and snapped pine branches. The smell of cordite never fully left this place. Up close, it didn't look refined. It looked improvised. 2 barrels stacked one above the other, 2 magazines protruding at awkward angles. A frame that clearly hadn't come off any factory line. It was heavier than anything Bobby had carried in combat. Fully loaded, it pulled at his shoulders. The balance was forward. He had been issued the weapon 3 days earlier, with minimal explanation. No formal briefing, no doctrine. Just a brief demonstration from an ordnance specialist who handed it over with a half smile and a warning: don't let it climb. Lean into it. That was it. Bobby had fired it once behind the lines. A short test. 40 rounds into a dirt berm. The recoil had surprised him. The muzzle rise was violent, but the target, with rough wooden posts at 25 yards, had been shredded. He checked both magazines again, 30 rounds in each. Chambers loaded, set to set. Beyond the trees, faint sounds carried through the cold air. Metal against ice, equipment shifting, low voices. German units were forming up. This was familiar territory for Bobby. He had been through these moments many times already in the Hürtgen. Artillery would probe first, a few ranging rounds, then a heavier barrage to pin positions down. After that, infantry would advance under cover of the chaos, closing the distance quickly before American rifles could regain control. And when the shooting started, Bobby knew what usually happened next. That silence had killed men he knew. He had watched soldiers fall during reloads, had seen squads lose momentum because suppressive fire vanished at exactly the wrong time. The forest punished hesitation. This weapon was supposed to change that. But in the minutes before contact, Bobby wasn't thinking about innovation. The twin Thompson pulled at his arms. He wondered how long he could keep it shouldered, how many seconds before fatigue slowed his reactions, how many rounds before heat and recoil turned control into guesswork. He adjusted his position, bracing the stock more firmly against his shoulder. If the Germans rushed hard, there would be no time to reposition. At approximately 3:47 a.m., the first shells landed 3 rounds short, left of Bobby's position, ranging fire. He flattened himself against the dirt as the second barrage came in. Airbursts shattered branches overhead. Pine needles rained down. The ground shook with concussive force. Then it stopped. The silence returned. And sharper this time. In the pause, Bobby heard shouting German voices. Orders being passed down the line, he lifted his head just enough to see movement. Shapes emerged between the trees. Gray figures advancing fast, weapons raised, the distance closed rapidly. 8 shots cracked through the trees, then the unmistakable ping of the empty clip. The Germans were still coming. Bobby felt his breathing quicken. He forced it down, focusing on the front sight. He had never fired the twin Thompson under pressure. He had no sense of how controllable it would be when adrenaline took over. At 40 yards, he stood up in the foxhole and brought the weapon to his shoulder. He aimed at the center of the advancing formation, and he pulled the trigger. The twin Thompson came alive with a sustained roar unlike anything Bobby had heard before. Not the sharp bark of a standard Thompson, but a continuous grinding blast of fire. The recoil slammed into his shoulder. The weapon tried to climb. Bobby leaned into it, fighting to keep the barrels level. Chasers cut through the darkness in twin streams, stitching across the German line. The effect was immediate. The first man went down hard. The one behind him stumbled and fell before he could turn. Bobby swept left to right, firing in controlled bursts longer than anything Doctrine would have allowed with a normal submachine gun. The top magazine ran dry, but the gun did not go silent. The lower barrel continued firing as Bobby's left hand dropped the empty magazine, pulled a fresh one from his pouch, and slammed it home. The Germans had been waiting for the pause. It never came. What followed would redefine the fight in that sector, and prove whether the twin Thompson was a desperate mistake or the solution infantry had been waiting for. The German attack did not slow. It broke. At 40 yards, the advancing line hesitated for a fraction of a second. Not because of fear, but confusion. The volume of fire coming from Bobby Castellano's position didn't match what they were seeing. There was no machine gun nest, no prepared emplacement. Just one American soldier standing in a foxhole pouring out a continuous stream of fire that refused to stop. Bobby felt the twin Thompson hammer against his shoulder. The recoil was brutal, a physical force that demanded constant correction. He leaned forward, locked his elbows, and let training take over. The Germans told him. When they were being hit, the first man dropped instantly. The second fell before he could raise his weapon. The third turned to run and made it 2 steps. Bobby didn't count bodies. He counted movement. He swept left to right in controlled arcs, firing in bursts far longer than Doctrine ever allowed. With a standard Thompson, this would have been suicide, then empty magazine silence, counterfire. But the silence never came. The top magazine ran dry completely. Bobby felt the change in weight, the subtle shift as the feed stopped, dropping the empty mag. Reaching for another, the lower barrel kept firing. Not a hesitation, just uninterrupted fire. German soldiers had been trained to recognize the reload window. They waited for it instinctively. Grenades were already in hand, ready to be thrown the moment American guns went quiet. But the guns didn't go quiet. The German assault faltered, then fractured. Men dove for cover behind trees that were never meant to stop sustained automatic fire. Bark exploded, wood splintered. Rounds chewed through branches and shallow earthworks. Bobby reloaded the top magazine and shifted his grip, maintaining pressure on the trigger. The weapon roared continuously, each barrel alternating in rapid succession. The Germans tried to return fire, but they couldn't pin him down. The twin muzzle flashes created confusion. From the front, it looked like multiple firing points. From the flanks, the sound suggested a belt-fed weapon. Someone shouted for support. Another voice yelled something about a machine gun. Within seconds, the assault had lost cohesion. Small groups began to pull back instinctively, dragging wounded with them. Bobby stopped firing briefly, not because he needed to reload, but because he needed to see. The barrels smoked violently. Heat shimmer distorted the air in front of the muzzle. His ears rang so hard that sound became pressure. He had burned through nearly 90 rounds in less than a minute. To his left, Private Miller was staring at him wide-eyed. "What the hell is that thing?" Miller shouted. Bobby didn't answer. He was already reloading again because the forest was not quiet. German voices echoed through the trees. Orders being shouted, the survivors were regrouping. And this time they were bringing something heavier. The second assault came less than 15 minutes later. This time it began with suppressive fire. A German Emberchi 42 opened up from deeper in the forest. its distinctive ripping sound, cutting through the morning. Rounds tore through branches, stitching the ground near Bobby's position. The MJ-42 was fast, accurate, devastating when allowed to work. Bobby flattened himself against the foxhole wall and waited. He didn't try to outshoot it. He didn't try to suppress it blindly. He listened. MJ-42 crews had their own limitations. Barrel changes were frequent and unavoidable. Bobby counted. When the German gun fell silent, wet just for a moment, Bobby moved. He rose into the foxhole, braced the twin Thompson, and opened fire again. At 40 yards, the German gun team never had a chance. The sustained volume of fire tore through their position before the new barrel could be seated. One man collapsed forward, another fell backward, hit while trying to run, the third tried to crawl. Bobby walked the fire across the position until there was no more movement. The psychological impact was immediate. German troops began withdrawing in small groups, firing sporadically, no longer advancing as a unit. The assumption that they were facing a heavy machine gun had taken hold. Radio traffic intercepted later would confirm it. German forward elements requiring incoring, Ammermord, requests for mortar fire. By the time daylight began to creep through the trees, the forest floor told the story. 17 German soldiers lay dead in front of Bobby's position. Several more had been wounded badly enough to be dragged away. The remainder had retreated deep into the forest. Bobby's platoon had suffered 3 wounded. No fatalities. The twin Thompson had fired over 300 rounds during the engagement. Standard Thompson doctrine recommended 2 to 3 round bursts to conserve ammunition and maintain control. Bobby had fired sustained bursts of 20 to 30 rounds repeatedly. Something that would have been impossible with any other submachine gun. That was the difference. German intelligence reports later described the engagement as an encounter with a prepared defensive position, reinforced by automatic weapons. They estimated multiple machine guns. They were wrong. It had been one man, one modified weapon. One solution to a problem measured in seconds. As the sun rose over the Hürtgen Forest, Bobby finally lowered the twin Thompson. His shoulder throbbed, his arms shook from fatigue. The barrels glowed faintly as they cooled. But he was alive for the first time in weeks. The forest around his position was quiet, at the absence of immediate threat. The men in his platoon looked at the weapon differently now. Not as an experiment, not as a curiosity, as something that worked. Word of the engagement spread quickly through the battalion, then through the division. Reports moved fast up the chain, not as theory, but as results. Casualty ratios, a broken assault, a defensive position held against superior numbers. The twin Thompson had passed its only real test. The Germans had given it a name born of fear. The Americans would soon give it something more important: demand. The most important effect of the twin Thompson was not what it did to German bodies. It was what it did to German assumptions. Within hours of the engagement in the Hürtgen Forest, German forward units began reporting something they could not fully explain. Radio messages intercepted by American intelligence describe encounters with heavy automatic weapons, and prepared men expected. These reports mattered. German doctrine relied heavily on identifying enemy fire correctly. Machine guns, especially bell-fed weapons, were treated as fixed threats that required specific responses than indirect fire, flanking maneuvers, or armor support. But the twin Thompson disrupted that entire decision-making process. From the German perspective, the volume of fire was wrong. Survivors consistently described sustained automatic fire that did not pause. They described twin muzzle flashes and a depth of sound more characteristic of a light machine gun than an infantry weapon. In several interrogations conducted weeks later, German prisoners admitted they believed they were facing multiple American machine gun teams. Some estimated 3 or 4 positions covering overlapping fields of fire. In reality, they had encountered a single soldier with a modified submachine gun. This misinterpretation had immediate tactical consequences. German units became cautious, assaults slowed, recon elements hesitated before committing forces. In one documented case, following a similar engagement later that month, a German company commander delayed an attack for nearly an hour. while waiting for armored support to neutralize what he believed was a fortified American machine gun nest. No such nest existed. The psychological impact of sustained and uninterrupted fire. They expect opportunities to move, reload, or counterattack. The twin Thompson denied them that rhythm. German training emphasized exploiting enemy reload cycles. When those cycles vanished, experienced troops found themselves unsure when to act. Hesitation crept in, and hesitation in close quarters combat was deadly. Several field reports warned units to treat American positions, exhibiting continuous automatic fire as priority threats, even if visual confirmation of machine guns was lacking. One report specifically mentioned the danger of advancing against American units capable of unexpectedly sustained small arms fire and advising commanders. This change in perception altered battlefield behavior. American positions that would normally have been probed aggressively were bypassed or engaged indirectly. Small unit tactics adjusted not because American strength had changed, but because German confidence had. A twin Thompson created an illusion. For American infantry, this psychological shift was immediately noticeable. Soldiers reported the German assaults broke sooner and regrouped farther away. Counterattacks lost their coordination. Fire became sporadic instead of concentrated. The enemy no longer knew what they were facing. This effect spread faster than the weapons themselves, benefited indirectly. German commanders, unsure which American formations had access to the new weapon, began treating multiple positions with increased caution. The presence of just a few modified weapons forced the enemy to assume many more. This was never part of Watkins' design. He had built the twin Thompson to solve a mechanical problem. The psychological impact was a secondary effect, but it proved just as valuable. Fear reshapes decision-making. German soldiers who survived engagements involving the twin Thompson later described the weapon as overwhelming. Rather than precise, they spoke of the inability to advance, of fire that felt inescapable, of positions that seemed stronger. One captured non-commissioned officer summed it up bluntly during interrogation. "You could not wait it out, it did not stop." That single observation explained everything. The twin Thompson did not need to outgun the enemy across an entire front. It only needed to break expectations at the point of contact. By early March 1945, word of the weapon had spread within German units, operating in forested and urban terrain. While intelligence officers struggled to determine its exact nature, EFIT soldiers had already drawn their own conclusions. For American forces, this unintended psychological advantage amplified the weapon's impact far beyond its limited numbers. For German commanders, it introduced uncertainty at a time when certainty was already slipping away, and uncertainty in war is often the first step toward collapse. Once the reports reached higher command, the twin Thompson could no longer be treated as an isolated experiment. What made it impossible to ignore was not the novelty of the weapon, but the consistency of the results. Multitude units, operating in different sectors, were reporting the same effect: sustained suppressive fire from a single infantryman, broken assaults, and casualty ratios that favored the defenders by a wide margin. The response from ordnance leadership was pragmatic: go rewrite Doctrine. Instead, the order was simple: build as many as possible, as fast as possible, and send them where fighting was closest and most unforgiving. Production ramped up immediately, but this was not mass manufacturing. The twin Thompson could not be stamped out on an assembly line. Every unit required skilled labor. The mounting frame had to be fabricated individually. The trigger linkage had to be adjusted by hand to ensure timing remained within safe limits. Each weapon represented hours of work by trained machinists operating under wartime pressure. At maximum output, the ordnance unit could complete only a small number per day. Demand quickly exceeded supply. Requests poured in from divisions engaged in forest fighting, urban clearing operations, and defensive positions expected to face repeated assaults. Commanders were not asking for novelty weapons, they were asking for a solution they had already seen work. By early March 1945, allocation became a matter of priority. Units operating in the worst close-quarters environments received the first shipments. Infantry divisions in the Hürtgen Forest along the Rhine and in urban sectors advancing toward the German interior were placed at the top of the list. Each weapon was delivered directly to the unit it was assigned to. Ordnance specialists often accompanied the delivery, providing brief instruction on loading procedures, magazine alternation, recoil control, and maintenance. There were no manuals, no formal training programs. Operators learned quickly or they didn't carry the weapon for long. The twin Thompson was never issued in large numbers to any single unit. Instead, it was distributed sparingly, a handful per battalion, sometimes only one or two per company. This scarcity increased its impact. When employed correctly, a single twin Thompson could anchor a defensive position or provide covering fire for an entire maneuver element. Its presence allowed rifle squads. The weapon became a tool of necessity rather than doctrine. Reports from the field described its use evolving rapidly. Initially treated as a defensive asset, it was soon incorporated into offensive tactics. Suppression teams formed around it, one operator, supported by ammunition carriers, maintaining continuous fire while the rest of the platoon advanced. This adaptation was never formula-proofed. It simply worked. As the weapon spread, so did its reputation. German forces encountered it in forests, villages, and industrial outskirts. The pattern repeated: misidentification, overestimation of American fire. But the twin Thompson also revealed its limitations as usage increased. Ammunition consumption was extreme. A standard infantryman carried enough ammunition for brief engagements. A twin Thompson operator needed double or triple that amount to maintain effectiveness. Weight became a constant concern. The weapon itself was heavy. Fully loaded, it pushed the limits of what a single soldier could carry while remaining mobile. The trigger linkage, while ingenious, was a stress point. Extended firing caused wear that required frequent inspection and adjustment. In some cases, improvised field repairs were necessary to keep the weapon operation. Commanders accepted these drawbacks because the alternative was worse. By late March 1945, waiting lists formed divisions, requested allocations that could not be fulfilled. The twin Thompson remained rare by design and by circumstance. By the time Allied forces crossed deeper into Germany and the war's end came into view, production slowed. The urgency that had driven its creation began to fade, replaced by new priorities and the reality that the conflict would soon be over. In total, only a limited number were ever produced. Enough to make an impact, but never enough to change the war on a strategic scale. And yet, for the men who carried it, the weapon had already done its job. It had filled a gap that no standard system could address. It had bought time where time meant survival. And it had reshaped how the enemy reacted to American infantry as victory approached. The twin Thompson stood as an anomaly, a weapon built outside the rules, deployed without doctrine, and judged solely by what it did under fire. What came next would determine whether it became a footnote, a cautionary tale, or something the Army wanted to forget entirely. The twin Thompson solved a problem that had been killing men in seconds, but it created new problems that could not be ignored. The first was ammunition. A standard Thompson gunner carried 5 30-round magazines, let 150 rounds total. That load was already considered heavy in forest combat. A twin Thompson operator needed twice that just to exploit the weapon's advantage. 2 magazines fed the gun. 2 magazines emptied fast. Units quickly learned that a twin Thompson without ammunition was worse than useless. Its value depended entirely on sustained fire. And sustained fire devoured rounds at an alarming rate. Reports from the field showed ammunition expenditure rising dramatically. In units employing the weapon, Polsons carrying multiple twin Thompson, ammunition carriers were assigned to them. Soldiers whose sole task was to keep magazines flowing forward. These ad hoc teams added weight, complexity, and vulnerability to already strained infantry units. The second cost was physical. The weapon was heavy even by wartime standard. Fully loaded, it pushed the limits of what a single soldier could maneuver with in broken terrain. Extended engagements took a toll. Operators reported rapid fatigue, shoulder bruising, and reduced mobility after sustained firing. Standing fire was difficult. To be effective, the twin Thompson demanded preparation, bracing against cover, prone firing positions, and controlled movement. This limited its flexibility compared to standard submachine guns. The third cost was mechanical wear. The twin Thompson was not designed for long service life. It was built quickly from salvage materials. The trigger link, with the core of its innovation, was also its weakest point. After hundreds of rounds, the linkage began to show stress. Pins wore down, timing drifted. In some cases, the firing sequence fell out of synchronicity, increasing recoil and risking damage to the mounting frame. Operators were instructed to clean and inspect the linkage daily. Field armorers developed improvised fixes using captured enemy materials when replacement became a constant concern. By alternating fire between two barrels, the twin Thompson reduced overheating compared to a single-barrel weapon firing continuously. But extended engagements still pushed the system hard. Lubricants burned off. Frames developed stress cracks after sustained use. The fourth cost was exposure, the very feature that made the twin Thompson effective. A sustained, unmistakable fire, a lie, also advertised its position. German observed flashes and uninterrupted sound. Once detected, twin Thompson positions became priority targets. Mortars, indirect fire, concentrated suppression. Commanders adapted tactics accordingly. Operators were instructed to displace immediately after prolonged firing, shoot, move, and shoot again from a different position. The weapon demanded mobility even as its weight resisted it. This balance was difficult to maintain. None of the cost outweighed the alternative. Silence. In the Hürtgen Forest and similar environments, silence meant loss of initiative. It meant broken assaults. It meant men exposed at exactly the wrong moment. The twin Thompson bought something no other infantry weapon could reliably provide: time under fire, time for riflemen to maneuver, time to survive contact that would otherwise end badly. Commanders accepted the logistical burden because the tactical payoff was immediate and measurable. Casualty ratios improved, defensive positions held, enemy assaults lost cohesion. The weapon was never comfortable, it was never efficient, it was never elegant. American ordnance officers understood this. In post-war evaluations, the twin Thompson would be criticized for weight, ammunition, consumption, and maintenance complexity. All of those criticisms were accurate. What those evaluations struggled to capture was context. It was built for a battlefield where 4 seconds of silence could erase an entire squad. In that environment, inefficiency was acceptable. Improvisation was necessary, and weapons that broke the rules sometimes kept men alive. By the spring of 1945, as Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany, the urgency that had driven the twin Thompson's creation began to fade. New terrain, new conditions, and the approaching end of the war reduced its relevance. But before it disappeared, the weapon left behind a question that no after-action report could fully answer. If a solution worked, but even briefly, but violated every rule designed to prevent it, was it a mistake, or was it proof that doctrine had failed to keep up with reality? That question would soon become inconvenient. And inconvenient weapons have a way of vanishing. As the war in Europe moved toward its end, the urgency that had justified the twin Thompson began to evaporate. The fighting changed, the terrain opened, the need for desperate improvised solutions diminished, and with that shift came paperwork. In late spring of 1945, Ordnance Commands issued instructions regarding experimental weapons deployed during the final months of the campaign. The orders were clear in tone, if not in execution. Experimental material was to be collected, accounted for, returned to designated depots. It had never been standardized. It carried no long-term designation, Officially, it existed only as a limited experimental modification authorized under wartime necessity, which meant it was not supposed to remain in circulation. The problem was that the weapons were scattered. They had been issued selectively, often delivered directly to off-intent units with minimal documentation. Some weapons had been modified further in the field. Others had been damaged, repaired, or cannibalized to keep remaining units operational. As the Allied advance accelerated, unit cohesion itself began to break down. Companies reorganized, abandoned, or captured. When ordnance officers attempted to account for the twin Thompsons, the numbers no longer aligned. Production records suggested roughly 200 units had been built. Field reports accounted for far fewer. Some were reported destroyed in combat. Others were listed as lost during unit movements. A handful were confirmed returned to depots. The rest simply stopped appearing in official paperwork. This was not unusual in the chaos of war. Unlike standard weapons, it represented an embarrassment to the system that had produced it. It bypassed procurement, ignored doctrine, succeeded precisely because it broke rules designed to prevent improvisation. In post-war planning, the US Army emphasized standardization above all else. Uniform weapons simplified training, logistics, and command control, and challenges rarely received publicity. By mid-1945, the twin Thompson was formally classified as restricted experimental material. Units were instructed to turn in any remaining examples. Further discussion of its development. Recovery efforts continued into the summer. Some weapons were shipped back to the United States for technical evaluation. Others were reported destroyed to avoid transport complications. But the discrepancies remained. Internal memos from late 1945 and early 1946 acknowledged that as significance, presumed destroyed, lost during redeployment, unrecoverable, none were definitive. Later intelligence summaries hinted at another possibility. As soldiers demobilized, many kept war trophies, sidearms, rifles, enemy equipment. For men who had trusted it with their lives, turning it in may not have felt mandatory. There was no widespread investigation, no public reckoning. By the time post-war reviews addressed the issue, attention had shifted to rebuilding, to new threats, to new doctrines. The twin Thompson became a footnote. Official histories of World War II made no mention of it. Standard reference works on American small arms ignored it entirely. It appeared nowhere in the narratives that shaped public understanding of the war. The classification would remain in place for decades. When documents related to its evaluation were finally declassified years later, the weapon emerged not as a celebrated innovation, but as a curiosity, an anomaly that did not fit neatly into the story the Army preferred to tell. A weapon that worked when it wasn't supposed to, built by people who weren't supposed to build it, used by soldiers who weren't supposed to have it, and then quietly removed from memory. The twin Thompson did not disappear because it failed. It disappeared because it succeeded outside the rules. And for institutions built on rules, that kind of success is difficult to accept. When the war ended, urgency disappeared. What remained was evaluation. In the months following Germany's surrender, the US Army began the systematic review of weapons used during the conflict. Some were celebrated. The twin Thompson fell into the last category. The weapons that had been recovered were shipped to testing facilities in the United States for formal analysis. Engineers and ordnance officers approached the evaluation with peacetime assumptions, or assumptions very different from those that had driven the weapon's creation. On paper, the criticisms were straightforward. It consumed ammunition at an excessive rate. Its maintenance requirements exceeded acceptable limits for standard infantry issue. All of this was true. Test reports noted that the weapon sustained fire capability, came at a cost, operators fatigued, quickly ammunitioning structure. From a logistic perspective, the weapon was inefficient. From a training perspective, it was problematic. Experienced handling, poor recoil control could reduce accuracy or cause injury. The learning curve was steeper than what the Army wanted for mass issue, and from a procurement standpoint, it represented a nightmare. There was no standardized production process. Scaling manufacturing would require new tooling, new training programs, and new supply chains, and new for a weapon whose relevance was tied to a specific set of battlefield conditions. Those conditions were already disappearing. Post-war planners were not focused on forests like Hürtgen. They were looking ahead to mechanized warfare, open maneuver, and the growing importance of combined arms doctrine. Like machine guns would provide sustained fire, standardized submachine guns would fill close quarters roles. Future infantry weapons would framework. The twin Thompson made no sense. But there was another less technical reason it was abandoned. The twin Thompson challenged authority. It had been created without approval, deployed without doctrine, and validated not by committees but by combat results. For an institution built on hierarchy and process, that was uncomfortable. Accepting the twin Thompson as a success would mean acknowledging that established performance reality. It would mean admitting that a field-modified weapon, built outside regulation, had solved a problem that official channels could not. That admission never came. Instead, the weapon was framed as an interesting experiment, that useful in limited circumstances, but unsuitable for broader adoption. The official conclusion was careful and non-committal. Yes, the twin Thompson demonstrated effective suppressive fire in close-quarters combat. Yes, it performed as intended under combat conditions, but no, it was not recommended for standardization. The report did not mention the Hürtgen Forest by name. It did not mention the reload window that had killed so many men. It did not mention casualty ratio. Those details belonged to wartime necessity, not peacetime planning. The Army moved on. New weapons programs took precedence. The M3 submachine gun, simpler and cheaper, filled the niche the Thompson once held. Like machine guns, assumed the role of sustained fire support. The twin Thompson was left without a category. It was too heavy to be a standard submachine gun, too limited to replace a machine gun, too unconventional to fit doctrine, and so it faded. By the time documents related to its evaluation were declassified decades later, the weapon had already been forgotten by most historians, not because it failed, but because it belonged to a moment the Army no longer wanted to revisit. The twin Thompson was a product of desperation, a weapon born from a specific problem, solved in a way that could not be tolerated cleanly or comfortably. Its success did not translate into policy. Its lessons were absorbed quietly, indirectly, and without attribution. In the end, the Army did not reject the twin Thompson because it was ineffective. It rejected it because it reminded everyone how close the system had come to failing the men who depended on it, and that is a truth institutions rarely preserve. When the war ended, most weapons went back to depots. Men went home, and stories, the ones that didn't fit neatly into doctrine, began to fade. Staff Sergeant Bobby Castellano survived the Hürtgen Forest. He crossed the Rhine. He lived through the final push into Germany. When he returned to Brooklyn in late 1945, he didn't bring the twin Thompson with him. At some point during the final weeks of the war, his company commander ordered all experimental weapons turned in. The modified gun that had kept him alive disappeared into the system. Bobby never saw it again. Like many veterans, he rarely spoke about the details of combat. When he did, he didn't describe tactics or innovation. He described moments, noise, weight, fear, and silence, or the lack of it. Years later, when asked about the weapon in a small interview conducted long after the documents were declassified, Bobby didn't praise it. He didn't romanticize it. He described it simply. It was hard to carry, harder to control, and it burned through ammo like nothing else. That was the entire point. James Watkins returned to civilian life as well. He went back to industrial work, largely unnoticed. His contribution earned a commendation during the war, but the details remained classified by the time restrictions were lifted. Decades later, he was an old man. He never gave a public lecture, never became part of the official narrative. His solution lived only in fragments, reports, interviews, and the memories of the men who had trusted it under fire. The twin Thompson never became a standard weapon. It never appeared in manuals or museums. It never shaped doctrine by name, but its influence lingered quietly. Post-war weapons designers understood the lesson. Even if they didn't cite the source, sustained fire mattered. Reload windows killed control over time, not just power in bursts. Decided close quarters fights. Future designs would address those realities differently. Lay larger magazines, belt-fed systems, squad-level fire support. The twin Thompson itself was never needed again. Not because the problem disappeared, but because the war that created it ended. History often celebrates weapons that fit cleanly into categories: rifles, machine guns, standardized systems that can be named, cataloged, and mass-produced. The twin Thompson was none of those things. It was an answer to a question asked too late and solved too quickly. It existed because someone ignored procedure and focused on consequence. For a few months in 1945, it changed the outcome of fights, measured not in miles or divisions, but in yards and seconds. 5 seconds, that was the gap it closed. 5 seconds of silence that had been killing men in forests where no one could see far enough to hesitate. The twin Thompson didn't win the war. It didn't reshape strategy, but it did something quieter. Far more important, it gave them time. Time to keep firing. Time to move. Time to survive. When historians write about World War II, they rarely mention the weapons that never belonged. The ones built in workshops instead of factories, the ones that solved problems no one wanted to admit existed. Those weapons vanish easily, but the reasons they were built do not. Because somewhere in every war there are moments when doctrine breaks down, systems fail to adapt, and survival depends on whoever is willing to ask a forbidden question. What if it didn't stop in the winter of 1945, deep in the Hürtgen Forest? That question mattered more than anything else. And for a brief moment in history, the answer was a weapon that refused to go ceiling.